All right. All right, so I think it's time to get started. So you hereby declare that the remaining of real-world crypto is only about blockchain. How about that? All right, so first session. We have Yehuda Litel, full cryptocurrency custody solution based on MPC and Threshold ECDSA.
Okay, thank you very much. I won't say the B word in my talk, though. This is a joint work with Ariel Noff from Bar-Ilan University and Samuel Renalucci from Unbound Tech. The motivation is very clear. A lot of people have invested real money in digital currency, in cryptocurrencies. And that money that they've invested or put in is actually at great risk. It's not a theoretical risk. If you do a quick Google search, you'll see a large amount of theft of money from exchanges, from wallets, over time getting worse and worse. And it's a real problem that we have to solve. And if we want to solve this solution, there are actually three different scenarios that we need to address. And we'd like to build a platform, or we have built a platform which actually addresses all of those three in terms of its flexibility. The first is exchanges. So exchanges are a way of enabling you to buy cryptocurrencies, sell cryptocurrencies, and exchange also between different currencies as a way of, I guess, managing your portfolio. There's a relatively high turnover. There's a necessity to be able to transfer funds at high frequency. And they actually have a real need to speed up their transaction rates. The problem is that because of the threat of theft, most of these exchanges have different size vaults, and they have a small amount of currency in small vaults that are connected, and you can transfer funds relatively easily, but they have the larger vaults completely disconnected from the network. And then when you want to transfer a large amount of funds, they have to transfer from the larger vault to a medium or smaller vault, and that takes time. And in fact, the largest exchanges can take days and actually sometimes only promise you 2 weeks to get your money back, which is a very big pain point, obviously. And so you'd like to improve that. And for this, you need to have a separation of vaults, of different levels of security, and of usability of speed around that. A second scenario that's of great interest is that of custody. Large financial organizations and banks manage or provide custody solutions for general assets, and they're interested in providing also custody for crypto assets. And here we're talking a very small turnover. So the situation is I have $1 billion that I want to invest in cryptocurrency, and what I want is I want this bank or financial organization to give very, very strong protection so they won't get stolen. I don't need to transfer lots of funds in and out very often. However, I do need to get my money back reasonably fast, because if the whole market is crashing and it takes 2 weeks to get your funds back, then it's already much, much too late. And this is a solution that's offered to high-end customers. And the final scenario is that of a wallet. This is something that holds a small amount of currency, typically used by individual people, and possibly is used actually for carrying out transactions. Although how much that will happen is yet to be seen. So what are the requirements on such a platform? The most obvious is that of security, but I want to stress something that's often missed in this space. When we think about security, so we all know that what protects cryptocurrency is a signing key. And so you think about the possibility of stealing someone's signing key. But in this setting that we're talking about, that actually isn't really the threat. The threat is actually fraudulent key usage. If I can use your key once, then I can generate a signature that transfers all of your funds, and I'm done. So I don't need to steal the key if I can use it. So if I give you the strongest hardware that protects your key, but I can access that hardware and generate a signature, then I actually haven't solved the problem at all. So of course we want to prevent key theft, but primarily the problem is that of fraudulent key usage. There's also issues of backup and disaster recovery. If I'm putting $1 billion into a cryptocurrency custody solution, I want to make sure that the key is not lost, even with very small probability. because a very small probability on a very, very large amount of money equals quite a high expectation of loss. We all know of stories of people losing their keys and losing the cryptocurrency, but a bank cannot take that risk, likewise an exchange, and therefore we need to make sure that's built in. There also needs to be flexibility, fine-tuning usability or speed of transaction with security, as in the exchange example of different vaults of different sizes. It needs to support different coins and systems, different signing algorithms, different standards like BIP3244 for key derivation, and all of that needs to be provided in order to have really a full platform to secure these assets. So the cryptographic core of our solution is a threshold signing protocol, or actually a suite of threshold signing protocols. So we support ECDSA, EDDSA, and Schnorr. EDDSA and Schnorr I won't talk about today because they're actually relatively easy in the sense that they're MPC, what we call MPC-friendly signing algorithms. It's a linear computation which can be made very efficient with MPC. ECDSA, on the other hand, is much more difficult. Our protocols support distributed key generation because you don't want to have the key present at any specific time. And if you think in your mind, okay, but I only generate a key once anyway, so maybe it's not such a problem, I'll do it disconnected. In this space, it's not true. Very often, you're generating keys all the time, and a lot of people, essentially the common practice is to generate a new key for every transaction, essentially. But even if not, it makes it much more difficult to really have a disconnected, secure platform, so we need distributed key generation. It achieves also proactive security, which what I heard people call here in previous talks post-compromise security. So even if some of the machines holding shares of the key are compromised, we want to make sure that we recover from that so that an attacker has to breach a full quorum of signing parties in a single period in order to be able to attack anything. We support rich access structures, so that means that you can have a different number of sets of parties with different thresholds in each set and an OR between them. Why would you want that? Think of a crypto custody solution offered by a bank. Then the bank would want to say that I need both parties at the customer and at the bank to carry out the signing transaction. In particular, the bank would like to be able to go to a court of law and have a cryptographer come and testify that there's no way the bank by themselves could have transferred the money out. And then I would also like to say that at the customer, you'll have 3 out of 5 parties from one business unit and 2 out of 4 from the management to carry out this transaction. At the bank, there'll be also possible different subsets that can approve the transaction. We also support two types of parties, and this is quite unique to our solution. We have both online signing parties and offline authorization parties. Online signing parties are what you would think of in a threshold signing scenario. You have a set of parties, and they have to participate in the computation in order to carry out to generate the signature. The offline parties are only authorize the computation, only authorize the signature, but don't actually participate actively in the protocol. And the reason we want that is because you can imagine a case where you have a number of parties who have to authorize the operation. They want to do it from their mobile wherever they are, and they won't necessarily be online all at the same time. So it's like an asynchronous authorization that the signature can take place. And forcing all of them to be online at the same time can be difficult. And what we do is we therefore have shares of the secret key also at these offline parties who reshare them to the online parties. And the security model that you get is that during signing, an attacker has to corrupt a full quorum of signing parties in order to cheat. But not during signing operations. Even if you corrupt all of the online parties, you still can't learn anything because the shares are also at the offline parties and you have to corrupt also a quorum there. So that's the property that we would get from that. So this is just an example of maybe you have a custody setting, you have a service provider, you have even an additional third-party trustee, you have the customer, they all hold shares of the key and they have to participate in order to generate any signature. And this is what gives you the strong protection against fraudulent key usage. Okay, there's no, because you need so many different parties from different places and you have strong separation between them and you need them all to participate in generating a signature, it's not possible to, for example, breach the machine that's connected to secure hardware and generate a signature because there just isn't any single place like that. I'll come back to the protocol later on in the talk, but what I want to stress now is that there's a difference between a protocol and a platform. The threshold cryptography, the threshold signing protocol that we have at the core is, of course, central to the solution, but there are many other elements that are needed, and I'm talking about cryptographic elements and not just, obviously, the systems and engineering elements which are important, but not related to what I'll talk about. So the things that I mentioned beforehand, like secure backup and disaster recovery, supporting standard key derivation, like this BIP key derivation that's done from a master key, proactive security, party administration, all of these things have to be done in a way that connect up to the threshold signing protocol. So if I'm deriving a key via SHA-512 onto the master key with some path string, then the result of that MPC to do that operation has to be shares that will then feed into the threshold signing protocol. And if I'm doing backup, then I'm not doing backup of a key that I hold, which is what we're used to doing. I'm doing backup of shares of keys. And I'll show in a moment why that's actually not so trivial. And all of that is needed to get this platform. So let's talk for a moment about the backup. Typically, you think of, so what's the problem we want to solve? We want to make sure that the bank or the exchange will always be able to get back the key and there won't be any danger that it's lost. So the scenario we're thinking of is you have some standard key like an RSA key pair, and the private key is in an HSM sitting in a bunker somewhere deep below the earth that requires 5 people to come and open the safe and also to input physically some password in order to open it. And if you think I'm talking about something imaginary, I'm actually not. Banks do have such systems for other uses, and they're interested in using that also for this scenario. So that's not an imaginary thing, that's actually what they want to do. And what you would think is I take the private key and encrypt it with this RSA key, and then you store that, replicate it many places, and you're done. The problem is that we don't hold the key, we only hold shares of the key. So that's fine, it's very easy. Each party will just encrypt their share of the key, and that's all that you need to do. The problem is that what happens if one of the parties is corrupted and encrypts an incorrect share? That's not something that you can detect because you just get an RSA encryption, and now your entire disaster recovery and backup is made completely useless. And since we're talking about protecting millions and possibly billions of dollars of assets, that's not something which we can afford to have, and therefore we need to have some zero-knowledge proof that each party will prepare to show that they've actually backed up the correct share, and only after we've verified these backups are we willing to actually transfer funds into the system. Okay, that's the idea. And what we do is we have a cut and choose type zero-knowledge proof, where essentially you encrypt either a random value or the difference between a random value and your share, and then you open one of them and you verify that these values all match up. It's not difficult to do, it's just something which is crucial. By applying Fiat Shamir, you get a non-interactive proof that's publicly verifiable, so each party, after key generation of the ECDSA or whatever threshold protocol you're doing, will then generate an encryption of its share. This will all be verified, and only then will the key be declared as one that can be used. Another component that we need is key derivation. So there are standards called BIP 32 and 44. For those of you who don't know, the idea is that in many cases, especially when you have wallets, you have a master key that you want to back up, and you will derive all keys in the future from that master key by applying SHA derivation to some path and the master key. In a case like a custody solution or exchange solution, you don't mind generating backup every time you generate a key, but in like a wallet scenario, that's not something that's viable. Now, a similar problem arises here like beforehand. What happens if, when we want to do this derivation, which we're doing in MPC, so because obviously we're not going to hold the key in any place, so we're doing some MPC via garbled circuits or something else in order to generate the derived key. The result of that is shares that are then input by the parties into the ECDSA protocol. Now you have to make sure that the parties input the correct results from that MPC into the protocol, otherwise again you're getting something which will not be a valid key. More importantly, or more interestingly, you have to make sure the parties input the correct share of the master key. Because if they don't, then what will happen is we'll generate a valid ECDSA key, and everything will be fine, but if you want to reconstruct that private key from the master key, you won't be able to because one of the parties input an incorrect value. And the crucial point you have to understand is that MPC protects the process of computation, but not that you input the correct value. MPC doesn't say anything about using correct values, but only that from the only thing that's learned is the output. If I input some incorrect value, that's not inside the scope of MPC. So we have an MPC protocol that actually enables you to do this in a verified way. I won't go into the details, but the idea is that you generate shares of the new key and of the old key, and the parties don't know which shares that they've got, and therefore they're unable to cheat, and you can verify that the shares of the old key indeed are the old key, and then the new key is the one that is actually used afterwards. As I mentioned, we also have proactive or post-compromise security, and this is achieved by essentially adding a random polynomial, if you're using Shamir sharing, a random polynomial with a zero constant term, and we also have party administration. I want to note that one of the important aspects that you get here that you don't get with multi-sig type solutions, beyond the fact that multi-sig is much more limited and doesn't exist on all platforms, is that if an employee leaves the company, then you need to make their share of the key be invalid. Otherwise, they're walking around with a valid share and they shouldn't have that capability anymore. In multi-sig, you would actually have to transfer the funds now because there's no way of invalidating that key. But here it's easy. You can reshare, and then that share becomes completely invalid. Okay, now back to the threshold ECDSA, which is the core of our solution. So it's actually been a long-standing problem to simultaneously achieve the following two properties. First, what we call full threshold, and that means that you need a quorum to sign, and anything below that quorum, any subset below that quorum is unable to generate any signature or cheat in any way. And to get that simultaneously with efficient key generation in the multi-party case has been a long-standing open problem. So for the two-party case, we have solutions, very recently have very efficient solutions. And for the multi-party case, there was work going back to the late 90s of Gennaro et al. And Hugo, who's here, and, but they don't get full threshold. And for any number of corrupted, so with full threshold, there's a work by Gennaro et al. From 2016, but that protocol requires the parties to generate in a distributed way a pair key, a shared pair key, and there's no practical way of doing that. We can do this practically with two parties. The best result was from crypto last year. It takes 40 seconds for two parties, so it's an expensive operation. For multi-parties, we don't even have any protocol that's been implemented. There are theoretical protocols. It's unclear at all that this is practical. So we presented a new protocol for ECDSA at CCS last year. Relies on the hardness of pair and DDH. And in parallel, Gennaro and Goldfeder also presented a protocol that has similar performance but works in a different way. To explain our protocol, at least the high-level idea behind it, just review briefly what ECDSA signatures are. So we have G, which is a generator of an EC group. We have the message M to be signed, and we have to generate this equation where X here is the private key, K is a random value, and R is generated by computing K times G. You get a point, and then you take the X part of that point modulo Q. And then the signature is R and S. Now, what makes ECDSA annoying for MPC people is this K inverse and R over here, which is derived from K. You have to generate this capital R and this K inverse in a distributed way, and that's a non-linear operation. That's actually difficult to do in MPC. Okay, and that's what makes it different from Schnorr or EDDSA that don't have this inverse type thing, and therefore they're much easier, much more friendly to MPC than ECDSA is. So that's the main challenge, and the solution that Gennaro et al. Provided in 2016 to do this is as follows. The parties generate shares, random shares, ki and rho I. Ki is the shares of that k value I mentioned, and rho I are random shares of a random mask. And then we use additive sharing, so we just define k to be the sum and rho to be the sum of those values. And then each party can send ki times g, so the ki there is protected because of the discrete log assumption, and they send an encryption of rho I under some additively homomorphic encryption. And this also requires zero-knowledge proofs to make sure you're doing everything correctly, and that's actually difficult and expensive, but I won't go into the details of that. After the parties get these values, they can add all the ki times g together to get capital R, and they can use the additive homomorphism to get an encryption of rho. So we're assuming an additively homomorphic encryption scheme, so we just add those and get rho, and then each party can multiply their scalar ki into the ciphertext to get ki times rho. And once again, we send that to everyone, you add them all together, and what you actually have now is k times rho. So you have an encryption of k times rho, and note that rho is random and perfectly masks k. I want to stress that in ECDSA, if you learn k, you can get the secret key out. Okay, so we have to make sure that k is not revealed. But it's k times rho, and once we have that, you can just run distributed decryption to get that value. And when you have k times rho in the clear, you can invert it, and now you have k inverse times rho inverse, and that's actually enough to complete the process. I won't go into the details of the rest, but that's really the main difficulty in doing what we're doing. And as I mentioned, Gennaro et al. Used Payer, which is the only additively homomorphic encryption scheme that we have, and that's why you get stuck, because it means you have to have distributed key generation of that, and we don't have that efficiently. So what we do is something different. We use what's called additively homomorphic El-Gamal and the exponent. What is this encryption scheme? The encryption scheme is exactly like El-Gamal, except that instead of adding A here, you add A times G. Okay, so you're encrypting A by adding A times G, and this is additively homomorphic because if I give you two encryptions, U, V, and X, Y, then you have an encryption of A times G here and B times G here, and if you just add all of these points together, then everything comes out to be a valid encryption of A plus B times G. So it's an encryption of A plus B that's trivially additively homomorphic. You can also multiply by a scalar in a similarly simple way. And this has fantastic advantages. Firstly, the encryption that we're using now is in the same group as the signature we're generating. Now, I didn't go into the details of what's difficult here, but when you're working in Payer and in some smaller group, then you have lots of problems of leakage because of different group sizes and possible cheating because the modular are not the same. And this is all solved by working in the same group. Secondly, zero-knowledge proofs are now all really efficient. They're all the standard Diffie-Hellman, discrete log, sigma protocols that we know and love. They're all simple. And key generation is highly efficient, simple, and also distributed decryption. There's only one small problem. You can't decrypt. This is not a valid encryption scheme because, exactly, I know it's funny, but we'll solve the problem. It's not that we're leaving it at that. So you can't decrypt because if you run the general decryption, what you'll get back is A times G. But A times G requires you to solve the discrete log problem to get A. Now, if you use this on small values, which was the original use of this scheme, then you can actually solve the discrete log. But in our setting, what we're going to get is an encryption of the signature. That's what we get at the end, and that signature is essentially, that S value is a random element in the group. So you're unable to decrypt, and so our entire idea seemingly falls apart. The solution to this is actually a general idea that I think can be used elsewhere to enable the use of El-Gamal and the exponent when you want additively homomorphic encryption in an interactive scenario. The idea is that in parallel to working in El-Gamal, the parties hold additive shares of the values and use direct addition and multiplication protocols to generate shares of the results, but in a not necessarily correct way. So if we have additive shares and we want to add them, that's easy, we just locally add. If we want to multiply, there are pairwise multiplication protocols that are reasonably efficient, are in fact quite efficient, but they don't guarantee correctness. They don't guarantee that an adversary cannot cheat. And correctness here is a problem because if you cheat and do something incorrect, you can actually cause a breach of privacy. So what we do is we run in parallel everything inside L given the exponent, and we prove correctness. And we run this private multiplication protocol and private operations without any correctness. And at the end, we have A, or whatever value it might be, and we have an encryption of A times G, and we just have to check that they match. And that's easy to do because proving things inside these groups is very easy. And if they match, then you can reveal, and we're finished. And you can instantiate these private multiplications either using pair or using oblivious transfer. Oblivious transfer is very, very efficient. There are very efficient private multiplications, but it's a lot of bandwidth. And since we're thinking of scenarios where you might have a mobile or a very different types of machines all over the world, we wanted to make sure we have low bandwidth. And so we're using a pair-based multiplication that's more expensive computationally, but has very low bandwidth. But I want to stress that each party has their own local pair key, and so you don't actually have to do distributed key generation. We ran experiments on this protocol in AWS with very basic, not powerful machines. We ran between 2 and 20 parties. We used the pair-based private multiplication. The oblivious transfer, I said, is much faster, and we have open conjectures on making the pair protocol faster, but currently these are the times that we have. For key generation, it's between 10 seconds and 30 seconds, but actually the majority of that time is each party generating safe primes. So when you want to generate multiple keys, you only have to do that once, and the second and third and fourth and 100th keys are actually very, very fast. In terms of signing, it's a few hundred milliseconds for a few parties, up to about 5 seconds for 20 parties. It's not as fast as we'd like in many scenarios, but let's think about what we're talking about. We're talking about a crypto custody scenario. A large number of signers will only be used for these very large amounts when the rate is low, and therefore this actually solves all the problems that we need for our application. So in summary, presented a new threshold ECDSA protocol. It supports practical key generation, signing, proactive security. There's a new paradigm, therefore, using additively homomorphic encryption MPC, which may be interesting elsewhere. And it's a full platform that provides the functionality that you need for exchanges or wallets or custodian solutions. It's also suitable for other scenarios where fraudulent key usage is very problematic, like, for example, a root CA. Such a system might also be very useful there. And it includes things like backup, key derivation, and this online-offline separation. And the security is based on a model of separation, which basically means as long as you can have enough parties in separate environments and with different defenses, that it's hard or almost impossible to get to them all, then you're guaranteed security. So thank you very much. I just want to note that the two-party solution for wallets is actually open source, and you can have a look at it there. Thank you.
So we have time for 1 or 2 questions. Maybe I'll take this one. Okay, so usually in the cryptocurrency setting, they use multi-signatures to solve similar problems. So there's clear advantages in doing this, but also disadvantages. So I guess maybe it would be worth saying a few words about that.
So firstly, you can always use a multi-sig and have some of those multi-sig signatures generated using such a system. Multi-sig has the disadvantages of you can't replace parties in and out. It's not supported by all of the currencies. Many currencies actually don't support them. And even those that do support them, there is a cost for using it, a transaction cost, and also a limit to the generic access structure you can get. So this is a much more powerful solution. Another question?
Near the beginning of the talk, you mentioned doing like BIP32 derivations in like a garbled circuit or something. But a BIP32 derivation is like on the order of 1 million gates or something. That's quite non-trivial. Have you actually implemented that? No?
Not anymore. Million gates is not a lot anymore. MPC has really come a long way. It's not 1 million gates, by the way. It's SHA-512, which, if I remember correctly, is about 50,000 gates.
Yeah, but then you've got to do... Well, there's an HMAC at each stave.
So it's HMAC, so it's actually you need two. You need two, so it's about 100,000.
Yeah, so 100,000 times the number of levels you have.
No,
so
you don't need to do. What you do is for each time you derive, you store the shares of each node that you derive. So you only need to go down the path once.
Yeah, I see. Can you give like a swag of what your performance looks like for that?
It's in the open source, so you can play around with it, but it's things in the round of 100,000 gates is in like the hundreds of milliseconds, not more than that. I think less than that even, tens to hundreds of milliseconds.
Yeah, thanks.
I was curious, for a lot of these institutions, something that's really important is proving ongoing possession of the keys, and that things like that for audit purposes. Is there a further leveraging of ZKP that you could use for that in an ongoing way, or is that open for the moment?
I think that the backup is what you have to make sure that you can't ever lose what you have. In general, with these types, if you ever want to check that we actually have the key shares, you can always ask us to sign on some special audit message. And if we can sign, then we obviously have the shares. So that would be easy to solve in that way, on an application at the application layer rather than the crypto layer.
Thank you.
Let's thank Yehuda again.
Thank you very much.
And now we have a microphone change, and we're going to go from a case of good custody to a case of bad custody, I guess. So it's going to be a tangled curl, cryptanalysis of curl P and other attacks on the IOTA cryptocurrency. And the talk will be by Neha Narula, who is miking up right now.
Okay. Hello. Great. Thank you. My name is Neha Narula. I lead a group at the MIT Media Lab called the Digital Currency Initiative. We focus on cryptocurrency and blockchain technology research. I'm here to tell you today about how we forge signatures in a cryptocurrency called IOTA. And this is joint work with Ethan Heilman. I cannot read all the names here, but Garrett Tanzer, James Lovejoy, Michael Colavita, Madars Virta, and Taj Dryja. Okay, so let's start. IOTA, for those of you who don't know, is a cryptocurrency that is designed for the Internet of Things. It has roughly a $1 billion market cap as of a few days ago. I think today it's down to 900 million. At one point in time, it peaked at 12 billion. And there are a few notable things about IOTA. So most cryptocurrencies use blockchain technology, which is sort of, as it sounds, a chain of blocks, a linear chain of blocks. IOTA, however, uses what's called a DAG, a directed acyclic graph. They call it a tangle. IOTA has partnerships with several large companies. Bosch, for example, has, in their own words, purchased a significant amount of IOTA tokens. Volkswagen has said that they are releasing an IOTA-related product in 2019. So important for this talk, IOTA has their own hash function, which has been referred to as curl. So I think first, for the purposes of the talk, I want to define a bit of terminology. So if you're familiar with a cryptocurrency like Bitcoin, IOTA uses slightly different words. So a payment in Bitcoin is usually called a transaction. This is how you send Bitcoin from one or many people to one or many people. In IOTA, this is called a bundle. They actually use the word transaction to mean something else. The currency in Bitcoin is also called Bitcoin. Right now, one Bitcoin is worth about $3,500. The currency in IOTA is called IOTA, but usually you refer to millions of IOTA. 1 million IOTA right now is about 32 cents. Importantly, most cryptocurrencies, in fact, I think all of them except IOTA, use binary. So they use bits and bytes. IOTA uses ternary. So instead of just 0 and 1, they use 0, 1, -1. A trite is 3 trits. And oftentimes you will see trites represented as letters, capital letters, from A through Z, along with the integer number 9, which is 0, which represents all 0 trits. So why did we even look at this cryptocurrency, IOTA? At the time, it was in the top 10 list of cryptocurrencies by market cap. So as I said, I lead a group called the Digital Currency Initiative, and we frequently get contacted about cryptocurrencies and about new technology. The person on the left is Michael Casey. He's the author of a book about cryptocurrencies. He's a journalist. And he got very excited one day. He came to us and he said, Neha, there's this new cryptocurrency that appears to solve all of the problems currently present in cryptocurrencies. Notoriously, cryptocurrencies don't scale very well. At the time, Bitcoin fees, I think, were pretty high, so fees were high. And to boot, it was also decentralized, which I've always taken to mean there's no single or small set of trusted third parties. So Michael came to us very excited about this cryptocurrency, IOTA. The person in the middle is my colleague Taj Dryja, who worked on the Lightning Network for Bitcoin. He just immediately flat out said no. Now, the problem is that Taj says no to pretty much everything. And so I was a bit fed up with this. And I said, Taj, you can't just say that everything sucks. You actually have to explain why it sucks. And so in this particular instance, Taj actually agreed to do this. And so he started looking at the code. And he noticed immediately the hash function curl, and he thought it looked pretty interesting. At this point, Taj brought in our other colleague, Ethan Heilman. Ethan enjoys working on hash functions for fun. So Taj showed Ethan curl, and then Ethan proceeded to spend the next entire weekend even skipping a party to try to break curl. So that's how we ended up starting to look at IOTA. So what is the nature of the attack that I'm going to talk to you about today? So the idea here is that Bob will sign a payment, again in IOTA this is called a bundle, where he gets $2 million roughly, and Eve gets almost nothing. Eve will then use this to forge Bob's signature and instead broadcast a payment in which she gets $2 million and Bob gets almost nothing. Importantly, our attacks operate in the chosen message setting, so Eve gets to create the payment that Bob signs. A note on impact and disclosure. The signature forgery attacks that we present here were disclosed to the IOTA developers. They then very quickly deployed mitigations for them. So to be clear, these attacks no longer impact IOTA security. And in the course of creating these attacks, we never interfered with or sent anything to the IOTA network. Okay, so let's talk about the general sketch of the attack, then I'll explain exactly how we broke the hash function curl, and then I'll conclude with a bit of discussion. So first of all, what exactly is multisig? Multisig in cryptocurrencies are very similar to the two-person rule that requires two people to agree to perform a nuclear launch. The idea here is that both keys have to be present. You have to turn both keys in order to launch the nuclear weapon. One person with one key cannot launch the nuclear weapon by themselves. Now, you might imagine why this is useful. It adds an extra level of security. And if one key is compromised, your funds are still secure. So multi-sig payments in cryptocurrencies generalize to require K out of N participants. Here's an example of a 2 of 2 multi-sig. So what I'm showing you here is 2 coins locked up in such a way that it requires 2 signatures in order to spend these coins. So someone has spent coins to a multi-sig address. In order to spend the coins from the multi-sig address, it requires the presence of 2 different signatures, in this case, Alice and Bob. And note here that Alice and Bob are then spending the coins to a single address. So you can go back and forth between multi-sig addresses and payments. So why multi-sig? Multi-sig provides added security. An attacker has to compromise both keys, and we can store keys in isolated locations. For example, you can keep one key on your hard drive and one key perhaps printed out on paper and stored in a bank vault somewhere. This is a technique that's used by many cryptocurrency exchanges. So a little bit more that you need to understand about IOTA to understand the nature of the attack. IOTA uses a signature scheme called Winternitz one-time signatures, or WOTS. However, IOTA modifies WOTS in a very important way. First, the IOTA code hashes the message with curl P27. I'll explain exactly what all those pieces mean prior to invoking the signature scheme. So the signature scheme looks something like this. First, you take a hash of a message, and then you use Watts to sign the message hash. So importantly, the signature scheme details here don't really matter for our attack because in IOTA, payments are hashed before they're signed. So if you can break the hash function, then you can forge signatures. Let me show you exactly what this looks like. So this is how we exploit messages that hash to the same value in order to create unauthorized payments. So imagine that you have funds that are locked in a multi-sig address, and they're locked by two users, Eve and Bob. So Eve, who's conducting the attack, will create two different bundles, two very special bundles that have the same hash. She'll then give one of the bundles, the benign-looking bundle, to Bob. Bob can inspect the bundle, note that it pays him the appropriate amount. Perhaps Bob is transacting in some way with Eve. And so Bob, examining the bundle and deciding that everything looks fine, then signs the bundle and sends the signed bundle back to Eve. Eve can then copy Bob's signature from the benign bundle onto the evil bundle, and then broadcast the evil, sign and broadcast the evil bundle. Now, what's important to note here is that Bob never saw or authorized this version of the payment. And the reason that we can do this, again, the reason that Bob's signature is valid on this bundle is because they have the same hash. Now, I also want to point out here that there's no racing here. In the example that I've just described, Bob can't transmit or broadcast anything. He doesn't have Eve's signature yet. So Eve really is the only one who can broadcast the bundle, and she chooses which one she wants to broadcast. So this is the general outline of the attack, but the question is how we actually go about creating these two bundles which have the same hash but pay different amounts to different users. We do this by very carefully placing collisions in certain fields of the bundle. So this is a bundle. This bundle is paying out to 4 different users. And what I'm showing here is I'm showing the users the addresses where the bundle pays, and I'm also showing the values in IOTA that are being paid to each of these users. So this is an example. We're paying 4 users. Now, let's take a look at this in ternary representation. So this is a sequence of trits. What we're going to do, the nature of our attack, is to look at very specific trits and create colliding bundles which vary in those very specific places. So here we're looking at the trits that correspond to the value fields in the bundle. And in particular, in the example that I'm describing, we are working with the 26th trit in the message block. And so here, the 26th trit for the value that is paid to Eve is a 0, and for Bob, it is 1. What we're going to do is we are going to create a copy of this that is exactly the same, except for the fact that the 1 and the 0 are going to be switched. So what this does is this serves to create an exact copy of the bundle, except for the fact that Eve gets the amount of money Bob was supposed to get, and Bob gets the amount of money that Eve was supposed to get. So to be clear, the technique that we apply here works for more than just multi-signature payments. It also works for single signature payments, but the multi-sig scenario fits our chosen message attack scenario really well. And also, just to be clear, the blue one is the one that Bob sees, where he's getting all of the money. The red one is the one that Alice sees. The red one is the one that Eve broadcasts, where she is getting all of the money. Now, there are a lot of limitations with this technique, and I'll explain a little bit more about that. We can only play this trick in very specific places, so we can't really create arbitrary bundles that have the same signature or have the same hash. So that was a sketch sort of how the attack works, but how do we actually create collisions? So let me tell you a little bit about curl P27. So curl is the way that this hash function was referred to on the internet. I think it's named after something to do with hair. P stands for prototype, and 27 is the number of rounds that a transformation function is applied inside this hash function. So to forge signatures, we need to be able to create colliding messages under curl P27. Here's what curl P27 looks like. It uses what's known as a sponge-like construction. To be clear, sponge constructions are quite often used in practice, and they are secure when properly implemented. Sponge constructions use this transformation function T, and their security really depends on this transformation function T. Curl P27's transformation function is very simple. It's the repeated application of a permutation and a simple S box. So how simple is the S box? Well, here's the S box for AES, and here is the S box for curl P27. Now, AES only uses 10 to 14 rounds. Curl P27 uses 27 rounds, but it's not that complicated. So let's talk about how we reduced collision resistance in curl P27. So if you were to just choose any random message, a random bundle, a sequence of trits, then pick one of the trits and flip it, then you would have a 1 out of 2 to the 42.4 chance of creating a collision. So this in particular is the 26 trit. So that's roughly 42-bit collision resistance. If we're very clever about the actual message we choose, so instead of just choosing random messages, we're a little bit more clever about it, then we can get it down to 1 out of 2 to the 22.87, which is 1 out of 7.6 million. And in cryptographic terms, in binary cryptographic terms, this is 23-bit collision resistance, which isn't really enough. So again, remember, the transformation function is very simple. We're able to solve a series of equations and constraints in order to get down to 1 out of 7.6 million. That still means that we have to try a lot of messages before we can find 2 that collide. However, luckily, bundles in IOTA have an additional field that I haven't told you about yet called the tag field. The tag field is 81 trits, and it has no impact on transaction validity. So it's 81 trits that you can vary however you would like, and you don't impact whether or not the transaction is valid. So in what I'm showing you right now, the tag field is sort of its default of all 9s, which is corresponds to all 0 trits. But what we can do is we can play with the tag field. We can try many different tags, and we can use that to create colliding bundles. So recall, curl P27 is built on the sponge construction. The way that this works is that you break the message up into message blocks. Each message block in curl P27 is 243 trits. And what we do is you copy the message blocks into the state, apply the transformation function, then copy the next message block into the state, and so on. So what this means is that differences after the transformation function is applied in the first third of the state are erased as new message blocks are copied in. And so we can take advantage of this as well. So to kind of show in figures exactly how this works, what we're going to do is we are going to choose bundles such that the differences between 2 different bundles, which vary in the trit that we're trying to vary, where the value is all in the first third of the state. So we have 2 different messages here, message 0 and message 1. They are the same except for the second message block, where they vary by 1 trit. This is where the value field is. And so if we start to apply curl P27, copy in message block 0, apply the transformation function, at this point in time, the intermediate state is the same for both messages because we've applied the same exact message block. Then we apply the second message block 1, and we've very carefully chosen the contents of the tag field such that when you apply the transformation function here, all of the differences are constrained to the first third of the state. And so what that means is that when we copy in message block 2, which is again the same between the 2 different messages, again, when we apply this transformation function, we end up with the same state. And thus, when we take the first third, which is the output of the hash function, they're the same. Okay. Now I have here a screen capture which shows exactly, it shows a demo of our tool that we use to do this. So what this tool does is it takes as input sort of a format, a template of a bundle. You can specify the addresses, you can specify the amounts in most of the places, and it creates messages that collide in two different places in the value fields. So exactly the example that I was showing you. The tool is not really very heavily optimized. It has two parts. We have a paper, which you can read to learn more about the two different sort of parts. One is constraint solving and the other is brute force. The first part is written in Python. It linearly solves the constraints. Then the second part is written in Go, and it is written to run in parallel. I'm demoing this on an 80-core machine. So here we go. And so we're running our tool, and it's trying to find collisions in the 3rd and 7th message blocks. So it's using all 80 cores. It found the first collision. That single core is the Python constraint solving part running, and it's about to find the second collision in a few seconds. And so it takes, I think, roughly 30 seconds on 80 cores for us to generate collisions, colliding bundles, which collide in two different places. And so on a laptop, this would probably be in the order of minutes if you don't have 80 cores. And then here we have a validation tool. And what this does is that looks at the different bundles, confirms that the two different bundles have the same hash, but they differ in two different places, particularly the value fields. So that is how we created colliding bundles under the curl p27 hash function. So a little bit of discussion about what happened after this. So in July 2017, we disclosed this to the IOTA developers. And in response, the IOTA developers replaced curl p27 with a hash function called curl with a K that is based on Keccak. However, it's important to note that, and I think still to this day, that curl p is used in IOTA in a few different places. So curl p81, which is the curl p function with 81 rounds, is still used for their proof of work algorithm, and it's used to hash transactions. And then curl p27 itself is also still used in a place in IOTA called milestone verification. So in IOTA, as it's currently deployed, a bundle must also be approved by an entity called the coordinator in order to be accepted. The coordinator is a trusted party run by the IOTA developers that approves and checkpoints the state of the IOTA tangle by signing it. The source code of the coordinator is not publicly available, and since we didn't interact with the IOTA network in any way, we can't really confirm how the coordinator would impact our proposed attacks, but we're not aware of any mechanism in the coordinator that would have prevented any of the attacks present in this paper. In addition, because the coordinator is not open source and we didn't interact with the network, we're not sure if it's still vulnerable to any sort of adaptations to this attack based on the fact that it still uses curl p27. So something really interesting that happened after all of this was that IOTA claimed that this was intentional and that it was a backdoor. So this is a quote from an IOTA developer. Curl P was indeed deployed in the open source IOTA protocol code as a copy protection mechanism to prevent bad actors cloning the protocol and using it for nefarious purposes. Once the practical collisions were uncovered, its purpose as a copy protection mechanism was of course rendered obsolete. So I interpret this as meaning that they purposefully put a broken hash function into their code base, into their open source code base, in case another project copied their code. They would be able to have the option of doing something with the fact that this hash function was broken. So my colleague Ethan asked them, did we discover a copy protection backdoor in IOTA? And they said yes. The answer is yes. You can read the full statement at the link at the bottom of that page. So let me sort of go over a few takeaways from this work. So first of all, in summary, we exploited weaknesses in a hash function called curl p27 to create chosen message signature forgery attacks. Second, I think probably a lesson you might learn from this is don't roll your own crypto. I personally am not a cryptographer, but I can tell it's pretty hard to get right. But the third takeaway, is that cryptocurrencies have many interesting security and cryptographic challenges. There's really a lot of low-hanging fruit here. And so if you haven't started looking at them yet, you might find it kind of interesting, and you might find a lot of cool stuff to uncover. My colleague Ethan was really excited to see a version of Watts implemented in the wild. And if you would like to read the original vulnerability report that we sent to the IOTA developers, check out our code, or read the paper that we presented at Black Hat in August, you can find it all there on our GitHub. But that's not quite it. So it turns out a few weeks ago that IOTA created another ternary hash function called Troika. In December, just last month, IOTA announced the creation of a new ternary hash function that was designed by a company called Cybercrypt. The way that this has been announced, there's a 200,000 euro prize pool if you can break round-reduced variants of Troika. So this is an interesting challenge. I think 1 and 2 round variants have already been broken. I mean, to me, this really, the obvious question is, why ternary? Why do you want a hash function for ternary? So here are some quotes, I think, which start to talk about that. So currently, IOTA uses the relatively hardware-intensive NIST standard SHA-3 Ketchak, this is curl with a K, for crucial operations for maximal security. We started tackling the hardware side with new thinking in computational processing, a next generation of microprocessor architecture based on ternary logic for ultimate efficiency in IoT is the result. A deep dive blog post on trinary's superiority over binary will come soon. So I haven't seen this yet. I can't really speak to why ternary is a good idea, if it will turn out to be a good idea. I think it's a bit worrisome because most of the cryptographic and security tools I know operate in binary. So you're kind of missing out on a lot of work there. Really quickly, just to conclude, I wanted to talk a little bit about cryptocurrency security. So this is something that my group at MIT has gotten pretty interested in. Not only did we go through this disclosure with IOTA, we also went through one with Bitcoin Cash. We went through a much smaller one with ING. And it's been really interesting finding out about vulnerabilities and disclosures and sort of seeing how bugs are dealt with in the cryptocurrency world. In particular, there's an increasing number of cryptocurrencies and code bases, and it's a scenario where attackers can very easily and anonymously exploit bugs for financial gain. It's a very challenging space to determine best practices for reporting, disclosure, deploying fixes, and communication. I really do think that this space is quite different than browser security or operating system security, and if you'd like to talk about why, I'm happy to do that. We're working and we're interested in creating a nexus where security researchers can work together across different cryptocurrencies to help figure out some of these best practices and to help figure out how to think about deploying fixes and communication. And if this is something that interests you, I'd be really excited to talk to you after this talk. So thank you very much.
Okay, so we have time for questions. Yes, go ahead.
You told us that they're still using curl, not only 27, but a version with much more rounds. But from your description of the attack, your attack still works for the many rounds. Is that right?
We haven't evaluated the time. We haven't implemented an attack for many rounds. So I wouldn't feel comfortable saying it works for many rounds.
Thanks.
I read the correspondence between you and the IOTA team, and there was a threat to sue you by the IOTA team for these disclosures. So they don't seem very receptive in this. So what is your take in interacting with such communities that are not receptive to security researchers, and what do you think we should do as cryptographers to discourage the community to use tools that are broken and don't accept this kind of criticism? There was some Twitter back and forth about a lawsuit with my colleague Ethan Heilman. We did end up getting a lawyer and working with a lawyer for after
pretty soon after we started all of this. It's kind of worrisome because I know that not everyone can afford a lawyer, quite frankly. So we were lucky to be able to do that. I think one thing that I was most struck by was just how different these communities really were. The people working on these cryptocurrencies and sort of the more traditional security cryptographer communities. There wasn't as much cross-pollination there as I would have expected. And I think it's really, really important. I think that there might be a tendency for security researchers and cryptographers to dismiss all cryptocurrency. and that's not what I want to intend, that's not my intention with this talk. I think that there really is a wide variety of expertise across different cryptocurrencies. Some cryptocurrencies take security extremely seriously. They have very good practices. They're very paranoid. They think very carefully about what they're doing. And then others do not. So I would say don't treat all cryptocurrencies the same, and please get involved. Please start looking at this.
Thank you.
I think that it would be fair to say that you and your team were received in bad faith, and that the IOTA team effectively continues to work in bad faith with you. In light of that, do you think that it is reasonable for a security researcher to participate in this new contest that they have going?
I think that's very challenging, and that depends on your own values and morals. I wouldn't hold it against anyone to participate in this contest. Part of the reason that we did what we did was I was worried about the users of IOTA, and so I think that if that's a concern for you as well, then you might be interested in lending your talents. You might have better places you'd like to use your talents. I think that's up to you.
Yes, go ahead.
Do we know why they chose 1, 0 and -1 as opposed to 0, 1 and 2 for the ternary this time?
I don't know, but I will tell you it made it really hard to debug our code, so and to read the values.
No, I was guessing they may have done it for the purpose of some balanced criteria that is used in the design of.
Sorry, for the purposes of some what?
Balanced criteria, you know, balancing 1, 0, -1. Those are the criteria that are used for S-box design typically. I'm wondering.
That's a good question. I don't know the answer.
Thank you. Great talk.
All right. Next question.
Did they ever happen to make any kind of statement to you or anybody else as to whether they have any other copy protection backdoors?
Yeah. I don't recall asking or getting an answer to that question. So, yeah.
And perhaps they don't recall if they do.
Hi, I got into an exchange on Twitter with Come From Beyond, and I'm wondering if you also came into any other similar criticism when we posed the question of Kirchhoff's principle. He said that it was not necessary to apply it because banks also didn't follow this principle. I'm wondering if they posed any similar criticism to you and your team privately as well, and if you're willing to comment on that at all?
I think all of the at least 90% of the communication between them and my team is now published on the internet. So you can go read that.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Hi, if anybody participates in breaking Troika, should we report the security reduction in bits or trits if we want to be well received by them?
Sorry, I didn't hear you.
Should we report a security reduction in Troika in terms of bits or trits if we want it to be well received by their team?
Yeah, that's a great question.
Thank you for your work. This was really a good talk to watch.
Thank you.
Next question.
Given all the exchange and all the context, is there any iota of truthfulness to their claim that this was an intentional backdoor?
I mean, it's really hard to evaluate as an outsider. I don't think that, at least I don't really have enough information to prove one way or the other. So.
Because if any problem in any product can be claimed to be an intentional backdoor, that's the ultimate cryptographer's protection.
Yeah, yeah.
Next question.
It sounds like you were very careful not to interact with the IOTA network for the duration of your research. It also sounded like that held you back toward the end. You discussed how curl P27 is still in use in their coordinator, and without interacting with the network, you can't evaluate it. Do you think that all of your future research into IOTA and other cryptocurrencies, you'll also stay off the network, even if you run into that kind of limitation?
We don't have any plans right now to continue doing any research with IOTA. So let me make that clear. Second, perhaps this was paranoia on my part, but we were worried about interacting with their network, especially in light of the fact that they eventually became to be seen to be a little bit almost litigious. We were really worried about the way that they would react. So we were very, very, very careful to sort of stay on one side of the line of only looking at published code, only running things on our own machines, not sending any messages to any of their servers. We were really, really worried about that. Did this hold us back from a research perspective? I mean, certainly I think there's a lot of really interesting work that could be done analyzing many different parts of IOTA, the tangle, the consensus mechanism, and I think that type of work would require probably interacting with the IOTA network. And so certainly it does hold researchers back.
And do you think you'll stay off the network for other cryptocurrencies as well?
That's a good question. I think at this point in time, yes, that is our strategy, yes.
Thank you.
All right, so let's thank Neha again.
Thank you.
And now we are on to a coffee break, and we reconvene again at 3:45.
All right, so it's time to get started again. The very, very last session of the conference. Save the best for last. Great. So we're looking forward to the talks in the session. So this is going to be our second blockchain session, and we're going to start with a wonderful result. And Greg's going to give the talk on two-round multi-signatures. All yours.
Very good. Good. Yeah, thank you very much. Welcome to the last session. I always say that it's probably like at the rock concerts where the best bands are kept in the last, and at the end there's fireworks and stuff. So I take it that that's the reason that why these two talks are programmed here. I'll talk a bit about multi-signatures. In multi-signatures, there's actually a bit of a confusion going on between the cryptocurrency world and the crypto, meaning cryptography world. So in the cryptography world, multi-signatures usually mean essentially n out of n threshold signatures, where a lot of signers together, each of them generating their own keys, sign the same message and come up with one joint signature for that one message. So it's like a special case of the T out of N signatures, but the great thing is that in multi-signatures, the signers do not have to engage in a distributed key generation to get their keys in place. So they sign this message, possibly through some interaction. I'll be focusing mainly on discrete logarithm-based schemes here, so non-pairing based. And these schemes will require interaction between the signers. There are pairing-based schemes that do not require that interaction. I'll mention them, but the focus here is mainly on the discrete logarithm-based ones. So they construct this one signature, and the whole point of this one signature is that it is shorter than just simply n signatures connected, concatenated with one another. And also that you can verify it much more efficiently than you would be verifying n separate signatures. So it's all about saving space on the one hand and saving computation on the other hand. On top of that, there are some schemes that have a nice property that is called key aggregation, where you can take these public keys of all the signers and pre-compute an aggregated public key from this, so that you can do the verification of the signature against this aggregated public key rather than the individual public keys. Of course, a trivial solution is, again, just concatenating all the public keys, but we want something that would be shorter and more efficient to verify. This being real-world crypto, maybe I should say something about the applications of these multi-signatures in the real world. And for that, it could be useful to go a bit into detail on how Bitcoin works and its blockchain and transactions in there. So a Bitcoin block consists of a list of transactions. Each of those transactions has input, output, and a witness. This is a simplified picture of it. But essentially what happens there, like an output, is essentially the hash of a public key of the recipient of the money in this transaction and the amount that is given with it. An input is a pointer to a previously unspent output. So each input refers to an output somewhere else in the blockchain and transfers the amount in that previous output with the same public key that was connected to that output previously in the blockchain. And the way that this is proven to be correct is that you add as a witness a signature under that public key of the input, or where the input refers to. Now, this would not work very well for all transactions, because the amount spent in this transaction would have to be the same, exactly the same as the output of the previous transaction. So that doesn't work very well for doing payments. For example, if you would have to pay a sum of 12 Bitcoin somewhere, it's actually quite a lot of money, but so suppose you have to pay 12 Bitcoin, and you happen to have 3 transactions from three different outputs, one of them with 5 Bitcoins, one with 6, and one with 3, then you would have to combine those to do that one payment. And so that's why you have multi-input, multi-output transactions. You have 5 plus 6 plus 3, which is 14, 12 Bitcoins, so you can keep 2 Bitcoin as a change in your own wallet. So typically you would put the merchant as one output and change as another output. And the way that you would authenticate this, this transaction would be that you would provide signatures under those different public keys of this transaction. You could use the same public key, of course, for all those inputs, but for anonymity purposes, often people would use different public keys for their different transactions so that they're not linkable until at some point they would be spent together. Now, what you can do with multi-signatures is that instead of having separate signatures under all of those public keys, you can actually just do one multi-signature under all of those keys, so that you have one signature and a list of 3 public keys that you can verify. It's more efficient in verification, but also it saves on network and storage space on the blockchain. Blocks are constant in size, so saving space is important to squeeze more transactions into a single block. And even just in total space of the blockchain, it's important not to be too wasteful with that, because currently we're already at around 200 gigabytes, and so saving is important there. Another application where multi-signatures can be useful is, it has already been mentioned in the previous talks, is multi-sig addresses. So multi-sig addresses are addresses where the output or the input, where an address is a hash of a list of public keys, and a threshold T of those are needed to authenticate a transaction for it to go through. So the witness contains a list of all the public keys and a threshold of the signatures. The reason why you want to do this is joint accounts, like if you're multiple people owning an account, but mainly also for additional security. If you want to have one key just on your laptop and one key on cold storage, or even in a Swiss bunker in a mountain, I'm not even kidding, that is being done. So you can do that with these type of multi-sig addresses. If you would use multi-signatures here, you can actually, instead of using the list of public keys and a list of signatures, you can actually just put the aggregated public key as the address, or the hash of the aggregated public key as the address of the wallet, and use one signature to verify it. It's even, this way you can actually have multi-sig addresses without that it's visible to the outside world that there's a multi-sig address behind it, if the multi-signature looks like an ordinary signature. There are applications beyond Bitcoin, if you were wondering. There are applications, for example, if you want to have a group of servers who are authorizing or authenticating something together. They were called co-authorities in a paper that presented the COSI scheme. Then they can do this in a compact way and efficiently verifiable way using multi-signatures. You can also have distributed random beacons based on this, where a number of servers authenticate that there's a common random value being signed, and this is really the random value at this point. Or, for example, in blockchains in general, when you have notarization. And notarization is where the community of nodes, they confirm what the next block will be. You can have all of the nodes doing this, or a random subset of them, but anyway, there will be a lot of signatures flying around. To make that more efficient, they can do a multi-signature, so you have a compact signature and possibly even a compact key of it. This is used in various cryptocurrencies and in other distributed ledgers that are not necessarily cryptocurrencies, but so these kind of schemes, the multi-signature schemes, are actually being used there. Okay, so in this talk, I'm going to present some of our recent results. I'm first going to have to talk a bit of the recent history of multi-signature schemes, just to give you a bit of an idea of the field. I will not be able to go into details there, but just to give an idea. And then our results, where we realized that there are actually attacks on existing two-round multi-signature schemes based on discrete logarithms. Fortunately, there is a recovery from the attack. We can actually build secure schemes, and then we'll be ready to conclude. So, brief history on these multi-signature schemes. So, I'm going to explain here a basic variant of Schnorr multi-signatures. This basic variant, we'll see, will be insecure, but this will be illustrative for seeing what the problems and the difficulty is of getting multi-signatures right. So suppose that you have 3 signers here, each with their own Schnorr public key. The way that you would normally do Schnorr multi-signatures is that each of them would go through their first round, they generate a random R, they compute T as G to the R, and exchange their T values with each other, and take as a final T value to be used in the signature the product of all of these T values. That T value goes into the hash, you compute the hash like that, and then you compute each of the signers, compute their own response as their R value plus C times their secret key modulo Q. They exchange these S values with each other, and the final signature will contain the sum of these S values. And you can check the algebra that if you do it like that, then you can check the signature, verify the signature by checking the equations right there. You can even do that in a very compact way because you can simply multiply all the public keys together to get one aggregated public key, and this is the verification equation that you would end up with. Now that scheme, if you just use it like that, has a couple of problems. And let me sketch what these problems are. So one problem is row key attacks. If there's one honest signer with public key PK1, then a second corrupt signer could change his public key so that he actually knows a discrete logarithm of the product of the two keys rather than of his own key, so that he can create signatures under both keys together, seemingly claiming that the honest signer has also signed this message, which is not what we want to do. There's multiple ways out of this. In the literature, there's one assumption made that just assumes a problem away. Just assume that all of the adversaries know the secret key corresponding to their public key in a security model by having the adversary hand over the secret key of all signers that are involved in the forgery. That assumption could kind of work if, for example, you're a manufacturer of devices and on the premises you do the key generation, so you know that your devices go out there into the world with well-generated keys. Then it could work. Any other setting, really decentralized settings, this is probably not a good assumption to work with. Other solutions are using interactive key generation, where all signers go together in one big joint protocol and generate their keys interactively, of course with the disadvantages of doing that protocol at the same time. Then there was a paper by Mihir Bellari and myself in 2006 where we had a different trick where we use, instead of using the same challenge on all of the public keys, we use per signer challenge. With the challenge I mean the hash value. With that you can actually get security as well, but it goes at the cost of efficiency and verification. And then in 2007, there was Risenpart-Jilek, a paper where they observed that you can do actually proofs of possession added to a public key. Essentially, a self-signed certificate on your public key will suffice to get provable security. Depends on the scheme where this works, but BLS is one, the pairing-based scheme, but also Schnorr is actually one where you can do this. And then recently, last year, there was a pretty cool trick by Maxwell et al., MUSIG key aggregation. MUSIG was the name of the scheme. And they realized that if you take an aggregate public key, which is the product of the public key raised to different hashes, that actually you can prove this secure. So actually these attacks are thwarted. So that's one problem, this row key problem. Second problem is when you want to do the security proof of Schnorr signatures. So it's a bit more technical here. Typically, if you want to prove the security of Schnorr signatures, what you do is you choose as a simulator the C, the hash value, and the response S up front, and you compute the T value that should correspond to that, and you program the random oracle so that the C is indeed the output of that random oracle query. Now, the problem in multi-signatures is that it's not this T1 value that will be the argument of the hash function. It's the product of the T1 value with the T values of the other signers. So the simulator is not the one who determines the value of the T value himself, meaning the adversary may know it before the simulator does and make a query on the hash function before the simulator has a chance to program it. So this whole simulation technique doesn't work anymore, and that's a problem for provable security. Okay, so a brief history on the multi-signature schemes. Essentially, you can go over the whole history and check like how did they solve these two problems. There was a scheme by Mikali et al. There was a two-round scheme where for the row key problem they had interactive key aggregation, and for a signature simulation they just went to a weaker model where they only allow sequential attacks. So there's only sequential queries that you can make to the signing oracle, which for a very distributed setting is maybe not what you would like to use. Then there was in 2006 the BN paper with a three-round scheme. We added an extra round before the interaction where every signer has to commit using a hash to their first round so that the simulator can filter out these things and check which is going to be the final value. So this was a different trick, but it adds a new round to the signature scheme. And Then there were a number of schemes that managed to do it in 2 rounds. There was a scheme by Bagherzandi et al. That was 2 round, and that used homomorphic equivocable commitments. We don't have time to go into the details, but you could blend things together, blend the rounds together, and you get a 2-round scheme out of that at price of some efficiency, but at least you have 2 rounds. There was a scheme by Ma et al. That went around the signature problem in a different way. They use an Okamoto-Schnorr technique with witness indistinguishable keys, so that the simulator knows one witness for the signing key and hopes to extract a different one at the end of the game from the forgery. So that way you can simulate signatures without getting in trouble. There was the COSI scheme proposed in 2016 that had no security proof, so had no incentive to get around the signature simulation problem. And then there was the first version of the MUSIG scheme that uses the music key aggregation that I just talked about, and got around the signature simulation problem by proving security not under the discrete logarithm assumption, but the one more discrete logarithm assumption, where you have a discrete logarithm oracle. And so to sign messages, you would make a query to that discrete logarithm oracle to be able to compute the response. Now in this work, we found that actually all of these 2-round schemes, or at least the fully secure ones, so not talking about sequential attacks, all of those are actually insecure, in the sense that there are sub-exponential attacks on them, and that there is an impossibility proof of getting any polynomial security proof out of them. Which raises the question, is it even possible at all to get secure, fully secure multi-signatures from discrete logarithms? We propose a scheme that is actually a variation on the Bagherzandi et al. Scheme that uses per message homomorphic equivocable commitments that actually can do it in 2 rounds. So there is a way out. Other ways out is going back to 3 rounds. This is what the second version of the music scheme and also a paper by Dan Bonnet, Manu Drijvers, and myself that we did independently that combines the technique of the music key aggregation and the preliminary hash round of BN06. And you can do that also with proofs of possession if you want, or of course switch to the pairing-based multi-signatures that are non-interactive. Okay, so on the attacks are based on Wagner's generalized birthday attack. What Wagner's generalized birthday attack does is, given a list of random values, it has an algorithm for finding one value in each of those k lists so that they sum up to 0. It's not obvious how to do that efficiently, but in the paper there's a method that is sub-exponential and can actually do this somewhat efficiently. If you want to apply this to plain Schnorr signatures, you can actually make lists of hash queries for k-1 honest signing queries. So you open k-1 parallel signing queries, and for those honest signing queries, you start generating a whole list of random oracle queries for different values of t. You don't have to know anything about that, but there's like a kth signature on the right here on the slide that you can compute by taking the t value of it to be the product of the k-1 other t values, and also generating a list of hash values negated so that their sum, when you apply Wagner's attack, is going to be the sum. So the sum of the C1 to Ck-1 is going to be one of the C star values on the right. If you use the algebra to sum up the S values of the K-1 signatures, you actually get an extra signature on the right for the forgery. So you can see that this algebra works out and you get a forgery there. This is a simplified version of the attack, but this is essentially what it comes down to. It's a sub-exponential attack, so it's not polynomial time, but practical enough to be scary. For 15 parallel signing queries, you can do attacks in 2 to the 62 steps, 127 parallel signing queries already in 2 to the 45 steps. So this is something to really think, okay, let's not use this in practice because this can actually go wrong. You could, in theory, avoid these attacks by increase the size of the security parameter, by increase the size of your modulus. So is there any hope for provable security? In our paper, we show through a meta reduction, no, there's no hope for that, because we can prove that if the one more discrete logarithm problem is hard, then there cannot be a security proof for any of those schemes under the one more discrete logarithm assumption. There are some technicalities here, but essentially it means that all currently known proof techniques under the most likely assumptions where you would prove it under, this will not be possible to prove, which is kind of remarkable given that some of these schemes actually had security proofs. So these schemes had subtle flaws in their proof, and they were definitely very, very subtle. So as in secure schemes, I'm just going to show it on the slide. We have the modified BCJ scheme. You see at the bottom left that the signature is slightly longer than what you get from a normal Schnorr signature. Verification in the middle right is also a bit more complicated, but we did some large-scale simulations on it. And so for 16,000 signers in a distributed network, we could generate a signature within 2 seconds. Bandwidth increase in this setup was about 20%. This was in the COSI framework for the COSI signature scheme. The increase, you would think that it would be more, but essentially like all the headers of packets and stuff, they start counting more than just the crypto material that is in there. And computation is increased with 75%. Now, other secure schemes, of course, you don't have to use our modified scheme because of the increased signature length. A bit of the point of using multi-signatures, of compressing things, goes lost because your individual signatures will get longer. Other secure schemes are the 3-round schemes that I mentioned previously. This is actually the most likely fix for the Bitcoin candidates that we talked about previously. And then there's, of course, non-interactive schemes from BLS signatures, pairings. This is actually the chosen fix for Randhound OmniLedger, some ledgers based on the COSI signature scheme, and Harmony, another ledger that was using Schnorr-based multi-signatures. So lessons learned of this whole story. As someone who spent most of his career in provable security, I would love that this was like just provable security could have solved all this and everybody should do it, and don't look around when you see a scheme that doesn't use it. But the problem is, okay, so COSI did not have a security proof, and that is bad, but other schemes did. So it's not quite such a clean picture here. So one could make this a message about verifying proofs is very important. And yes, that is important. But then even when knowing that some of these proofs had flaws, for some of the schemes it was easy to spot them. Other schemes, it's really not that easy to spot. So even reviewing security proofs, it's not that easy. We actually, somewhat embarrassingly, in a previous version of this paper, had a different scheme as a fix, which actually also made a mistake. And it was spectacular reviewing by an anonymous reviewer, to whom we're very grateful, of spotting that flaw. But it is extremely subtle. So what are the lessons that we learn here? Well, proofs are subtle, especially forking lemmas that have rewinding arguments in them. They can get pretty damn subtle, so you have to be careful with those and try to write out the proofs in a lot of detail so you can get it right. But in some way, we're all just human. So what we would actually like to have is some more tool support for at least verifying these proofs, maybe even creating them, but verifying these proofs for their correctness with some mechanical support would actually be great. One piece of advice is also, so this pre-round of hashes that was in the BN06 scheme seemed pretty useless, and because I was an author of that paper as well, I remember that we introduced that round just because we couldn't see how we would otherwise prove it secure, so we just introduced it. Just dropping that round because it seems pretty useless is dangerous. There could be attacks hiding beneath the surface, so don't just drop things that you don't see the immediate use of in a cryptographic scheme. And so yeah, it's not a clean picture for provable security, but it's not a perfect tool. It is the best tool that we have at the moment, so maybe provable security is not going to save the world, but the world is definitely lost without it. Thank you.
Great, that was really cool. So we have time for questions? Must be some questions on this. It's what? We have one. Well, we still have one time for one question. So do you have a sense of this new the 2-round scheme that you have? It sounds like it's not the one you recommend using because of efficiency reasons.
So indeed, because of efficiency reasons, it will not be the one that for many applications will be the one that will be very useful. We see it mainly as a proof of concept of like it is possible to have, it can be done, it can be done. Maybe there are applications where this actually makes sense, but I think in applications where there's a lot of single signer signatures showing up, then of course the added signature length will not make sense.
And it also increases verification time.
Exactly, also that.
Is why the 3 round probably is the one that's going to get used.
Absolutely.
Awesome. All right, so with that, let's thank Greg again and move on to the next talk. All right, so with that, we're going to move on to the last talk of the conference. So I'm very excited to introduce Zuko, who's going to tell us about an amazing deployment of very advanced cryptography, the system called Zcash, and looking forward to the talk as soon as we get all the adapters adapted. Good? Awesome. All right, all yours.
Well, I don't know if that's working. And do I get a clicker or do I just hit the arrow keys? Okay, that'll work. But so far, it's not working. Well, that talk was awesome. This talk is going to be very different. Do I have 20 minutes?
Yes. No, you have 25.
I have 30 minutes, so I'm going to take 20. I'm going to aim for 20 because I want lots and lots of questions, okay? Though I didn't want to show those slides anyway. That's not true. I do want to show the slides. But last talk, thank you all for being here. My name is Zuko, and this is about Zcash, which is one of those cybercoins. So yeah, they're called cryptocurrencies, and when you say things more times per day, you have to shorten them, so they started getting called cryptos. So then there was a backlash where people started wearing shirts and carrying signs that said crypto means cryptography. So I've decided to fix this by renaming them to cybercoins. Yeah, so this talk is going to be very different from the last one because I was asked to talk about government regulation. And so there's almost no cryptography in my talk. Oh yeah, I have slides. I'm going to talk about ancient history, morality, key management, love notes, and government regulation. First of all, the reason why me and, as far as I can tell, everyone else who's doing Zcash is doing it is because we feel like it's important for basic human rights and for protecting our society, which seems to be hurtling into a previously untried, dangerous situation in which you require the continuous permission of some centralized third party to communicate and to participate in the economy. And that's dangerous and wrong, and we're trying to provide an alternative. Zcash came out of cryptography. The whole idea was originally invented by these scientists at the bottom: Christina Garman, Ron Tromer, Alessandra Chiesa, Eli Ben Sasson, Matt Green, Ian Myers, Medard Zverza, many of whom were here at this conference. Last year at RWC, Ian Myers gave a talk about the actual cryptography of Zcash, so I hope you saw that. And if you didn't, maybe you should go look it up after this. All right, very simply, Bitcoin is actually just an Excel spreadsheet, it turns out, with some kind of magic layer that makes it so everyone around the world is looking at the same version of the Excel spreadsheet at the same time as each other. And once you have that magic layer, then if you want to make money in it, you just put random identifiers, and then everyone who's maintaining the shared global Excel spreadsheet inspects everyone else's transactions to make sure that the integrity constraints are met, such as that there's, if somebody spent the money to one person, they can't also spend the money to a second person or invent money out of thin air or whatever. And the obvious problem with this is that now if you use this kind of system and you go buy coffee, now North Korean hackers know your net worth and what you just did, and so does everyone else. So it's a total non-starter for commercial security, national infrastructure, mass market adoption. And Satoshi and Hal Finney presumably kind of thought the same way because they tried to fix it in early 2009. But in early 2009, there was no known way to fix it. And the way that those scientists came up with on that previous slide in about 2013, 2014 was to use ZK snarks. So instead of posting the clear text of all your transactions to the Excel spreadsheet, this is very oversimplified, but the oversimplified cryptography version is instead of posting the clear text transactions, you post encrypted transactions in which the random unique identifier of the sender and that of the receiver and the amount transferred are all hidden from the rest of the users of the ledger, but you have a zero knowledge proof appended to each one, which satisfies all of the maintainers of the system that this encrypted transaction doesn't violate any of the integrity constraints. Now, now we did something, so that this is called, I was asked to talk about lessons learned, and so now I'm going to tell you a whole bunch of details which could have been different in an alternate universe, but this is what did happen, and so let's try to learn from that. 2, 3, 4 years ago, when those aforementioned scientists and I set out to make this into a real world product for everyone to use, we decided to include backwards compatible clear text version, clear text option. And frankly, this was sheerly a go-to-market and engineering hack to make it. The reason we did it was just to make it easy for third parties to onboard Zcash by using the old-fashioned unencrypted version that they were already familiar with. And that totally worked. We've got all kinds of wallets and exchanges and third-party services and products of all kinds that use Zcash now because they can just use the clear text version. But now this leaves us with this complication, which is there are two flavors of Zcash addresses, which we call transparent addresses and shielded addresses. And when you say something too many times a day, you have to shorten it. So we started calling them T-adders and Z-adders, and now we've started calling them tatters and zatters in our cybercoin. Now, this is what it actually looks like if you load up any one of the many public blockchain explorers on the web and ask them what's the current and recent and historical state of the Zcash blockchain. You can find something that looks like this, where some of the transactions have a tatter from the sender and the receiver, and you can see how much they sent. If there are multiple such transactions, you can start linking them together and realizing that there's a pattern of money going from one to the other or from one to many different recipients and so on. Others of the transactions have zatters, and those ones you can't see anything that we were able to encrypt with those starting keys, we did. And then there are some transactions that don't reveal anything except for the timestamp, because all you know is that some unknown shielded addresses sent some unknown amount to some other unknown shielded address. That's what it looks like today. Now, that was the oversimplified cryptography. This is the oversimplified International Cybercoins regulation map. There's basically 3 important things so far. All of the gray area is confusion and dismay because the laws are written making assumptions about what money is and how things work, which assumptions are no longer true, and no one knows how the laws would apply if you were using cybercoins. And so people are using them anyway in all those countries, but no one knows what the laws are. In India and China, they've effectively pushed out exchanges. So exchanges are just cybercoin banks, right? Those are effectively banned in India and China. And then in the United States regulatory regime is extremely complicated because there are literally an uncounted number of agencies that might or might not have jurisdiction over different parts of regulation, including state and federal. But despite that, the United States has actually made pretty good progress about clarifying how the existing laws should be interpreted to apply to cybercoins. So one of the interesting things that happened is this logo stamped on this map is the New York Department of Financial Services. And they did something that was pretty remarkable several years ago. So a typical regulatory rule would say, here's a bunch of rules that you have to abide by. And if you violate these rules, you're in trouble. And then another typical thing is, we're going to be watching you, maybe coming and inspecting and testing or whatever, and if we've decided that you're doing something wrong, you're going to hear about it and you're going to be forced to change, or you might even be punished. So those are standard, like a set of rules in advance, or you're going to be supervised is another way to do it. The New York Department of Financial Services went for yet a third idea, which is anything you want to do, you have to come ask us for permission first. It was a very forward-leaning regulator. And so a couple of cybercoin companies said, well, fine then, I'm just not going to let any New Yorkers use my product, but that's a question of how you achieve that. But almost all the other cybercoin companies lined up and started asking for permission to do stuff. So the companies in question are what I call exchanges, what everyone calls exchanges, which are financial intermediaries. They're just like banks. And they're the ones that need permission to do stuff. So I and my team at the company, I didn't explain this, but in addition to being a scientific discovery and in addition to being an open source decentralized network, there is also a for-profit company that I'm the CEO of. And I and my team from the company flew to New York a few times and met with these regulators to try to persuade them to give permission to the exchanges, who are not me, but I wanted them to give permission to the exchanges. And so I offered to come give them like free tutorials in cryptography. And like the slides you've been seeing are basically the same things I was showing them. And the arguments I put forth were, first of all, just here's how it works, because knowledge is the best antidote to fear. And second of all, this is compatible with the way we do regulation in the United States. So financial regulation in the United States is all focused on the financial intermediaries, like banks. There's a whole bunch of different rules, and they all have three-letter acronyms about how you have to identify your customer and keep copies of scans of their driver's license, and you have to report certain kinds of behaviors to other people, and there's a whole suite of regulations for consumer protection and a whole different suite of regulations for financial system stability and anti-terrorism and drug money tracking and all that. But all of those are rules for the financial intermediary to take. Like if you get some cash from an ATM and you go buy something, none of those rules apply to you as an individual. They all apply to the bank. So we said, this was the first argument, or this argument was, the exchanges can abide by all the same rules while they're using this encrypted blockchain as the transport layer. And the third argument we made was historical analogy, which is that I was there in the 1990s when HTTPS was being invented. And it was new and strange, and to some people it was scary. So the young people in this room might think I'm exaggerating, but the old-timers in this room, many of whom were a part of this struggle, no, this isn't an exaggeration. It really was the case that a lot of sincere, intelligent people thought that the development of HTTPS would undermine society and allow crime to run rampant. And there was a small but powerful faction in the United States government that tried to prevent it with a lot of bad policy and bad technology and dirty tricks and so on. And what I generally emphasize when talking to regulators like this is, and then look what happened. They delayed progress for a long time. They almost managed to drive Silicon Valley into a different country, and but then they failed, and the World Wide Web got encryption. The rest of the internet got encryption eventually. And now look, those same government agencies that tried to prevent it now require it, right? They require it for their own protection, and they require companies to use it for the protection of their users. And fourthly, I said to them, we have a lot of shared values. We want a safe society, we want low crime, we want democracy, and encryption is just part of the fabric of an open, safe society. It's not dangerous. So much to my surprise, they then announced that Zcash, including the encrypted transactions, are now one of the half a dozen coins that you're allowed to use for New Yorkers. So that was an amazing success in regulation, in my opinion. Now I'm going to explain. Oh, good. I'm only like 13 minutes in. This is great. You better be storing up a lot of questions. One consequence of that is, this is a map of all those exchanges that support Zcash around the world, and one consequence of that is that Gemini, which is located in New York and is widely considered to be the most regulatorily upstanding of exchanges, and Coinbase in San Francisco, which is by far the biggest and most influential cybercoin exchange in the US, now provide Zcash services to their users. Okay, now I'm going to go one layer down into the technology, which is all about key management. So this is one of the things that I had to explain to the regulators. There's this thing called viewing keys. And as cryptographers, viewing keys are very simple because viewing keys are decryption keys. The way the Zcash is structured, you can share a key which will allow someone to decrypt some subset of the blockchain, but not to spend the money. Make sense? And in Zcash, a viewing key is always and only available to the parties to the transaction. That's my #1 lesson learned from this story so far, the first 2 years. When we set out, it was widely believed that you would have to either build in some kind of backdoor or have weak cryptography or just be in the clear or something if you wanted to be accepted by governments and be integrated into the mainstream financial system. And that's the main lesson learned so far is we didn't do that. We made the strongest cryptographic structure we could think of to protect the users. And then we just argued for that and pitched it as a good idea and compatible with the law, and that worked. So that disproved, so far, for the first 2 years, that disproved this widely held belief that government and cryptography are incompatible. So the important fact why I'm emphasizing that is that viewing keys are not a backdoor, they are just the keys which you have to have in order to see your own transactions in the blockchain. So Zcash combines the immutable append-only blockchain properties with the encryption properties. And the encryption properties are third parties, unauthorized third parties can't see it, and you can delegate your decryption key to someone, and if you do, they'll be able to see it. That's just a consequence of math. So those eyeglasses are on ZSBZ there. ZSBC's magic eyeglasses, when he looks through them, he can see his transaction in the blockchain, but nobody else's. He can see that somebody sent him, and that recipient is ZSBC there, somebody sent him 0.14 ZEC, which is much less than 13 Bitcoins. And there's an encrypted memo field in all the encrypted Zcash transactions, where you can put, whatever your invoice number or whatever you need. Now, if ZSBZ lends his eyeglasses to someone else, they can see his transaction in the blockchain, but no one else's, right? And here's someone else's transactions with different eyeglasses. And one of those transactions is a very small number of ZEC, and it says, I love you. Because just like the nuclear bunkers under the mountains in Switzerland being a real thing, encrypted love notes in the blockchain are a real thing. 2 years ago, just after Zcash launched, a young lady I know said that she received a very small amount of Zcash, And in the memo field, there was a link to IPFS, which is a decentralized data storage thing. And so when she pasted the link or the hash into IPFS, it showed her tickets to an overseas event that she and her boyfriend had been talking about going to. So it was an encrypted love note in the blockchain. And I'm just taking her word for that because since I was not the sender recipient, it's invisible to me, but it's in this immutable, it's kind of like carving your initials in a tree because it's a long-term thing, so you can't get it out of the blockchain anymore, but it's private, it's only between the two of you. And I've heard about more than one of those, actually, so encrypted love notes in the blockchain are an actual thing. So this is pretty much, I wanted to focus on like backward-looking, empirical, factual things to learn from as much as possible. I think we're to the transition point where I tell you sort of my hopes and dreams and fears for the future. This is as far as we've gotten. Zcash exists out there, it's used in a lot of these exchanges, and it currently it's on the whitelist in New York. However, yeah, Dan.
Why ZSB is, why the I love you recipient is public, is viewable?
This one? Oh, the sender.
The recipient.
So the recipient of the I love you is ZSSB. And in this slide, we're looking with ZSSB's eyeglasses. In the previous slide, we're looking with ZSW4's eyeglasses. ZSW4 is the sender, so when you use the view key, you can tell all the things that you sent and all the things that you received, but you can't see the identity of the sender of the things that you received, unless they choose to reveal that to you. Because, of course, you can selectively disclose keys to specific people. So if you want someone to see that you're the sender, you can prove it to them by revealing your view key, which doesn't give them the ability to spend your money. Okay, so frankly, I'm very proud of this. I think we did very well on multiple levels so far. But are you all aware of how there's a new law in Australia that any software that is provided to Australians has to come with a backdoor for the Australian government? Any software made anywhere on the planet? So I'm not sure that progress can't be rolled back. And also, it needs to be rolled forward more. So here's the pitch that now we're shifting into the forward-looking thing. Now I'm going around to a bunch of governments, and I'm arguing for them. I'm arguing to them that they need to require strong encryption in their cybercoins from now on, and here's why. It's because once you understand the technology, then you think, what if the citizens of my country, you're the government of Singapore, what if the citizens of Singapore are using cybercoins? Most of them, almost all of them, are going to use it by logging on to an exchange. Just like most people prefer banks over cash. That's for most things. Well, if you're using a purely clear text cybercoin like Bitcoin, then you, the government of Singapore, will be able to tell what the Singaporeans are doing. And also, the government of Japan and Russia will also be able to tell what the Singaporeans are doing, and also everyone else on the whole internet will be able to tell everything about it. What if instead they log on to an exchange in Japan that uses Zcash, that uses Zatters specifically? Let's forget all about Tatters, transparent addresses. In that case, you're not going to be able to see anymore what the Singaporeans are doing when they log on over HTTPS to the Japanese exchange and initiate encrypted transactions in the Zcash blockchain. All of that is out of your view. But the Japanese regulators and law enforcement and government will be able to see what the Singaporeans are doing, no problem. But fortunately, the rest of the world won't. What if instead there's an exchange located in Singapore and the Singaporeans log on to that, which empirically people prefer to do. They prefer to use local financial institutions. In that case, you, the government of Singapore, will know what the Singaporeans are doing. The government of Russia and Japan won't, and all of the random hackers and griefers on the net won't. So now, O government of Singapore, think through which of these rows you most like. That's my next argument, and I don't know if this is going to work. And like I say, I don't know if how far we've gotten is going to, if the tide's not starting to roll back. But it doesn't matter necessarily to us in one sense, because we're doing this because we think it's fundamentally necessary for human rights. It's just the right thing to do, and it's fundamentally dangerous to allow anything else in our societies. And so, whichever way that political struggle goes, we're going to keep going with what we think is right. And it's a very open system. Zcash and many, but not all, of the other cybercoins, as we heard earlier, are very open systems where everyone can see all the pieces and can contribute. And you're all invited to help. The good guys won last time around, thanks in part to some risks and some creativity and some struggle from many people who are in this room. But the victory of good is never complete. Thanks.
So thank you, Zuku, for doing all this work. It's really quite remarkable. For me, it's also amazing to see this wonderful crypto technology being put to good use.
Thank you.
Yes. So we have time for questions. I see. Actually, I'm going to take the chair's prerogative and ask the first question. So could you, there are other, you call the cybercoins projects that are trying to provide privacy.
Oh, yeah.
Arrow, Dash, maybe even Grin. Could you maybe compare a little bit the security and privacy?
Ooh, I could maybe barrel you real quick. That's a really deep question. Basically, the approach in the zero cache design is by far the best. And for a very straightforward reason, which is that minimal information is disclosed. Like, everybody asks this question in audiences where they can't understand the answer, and I don't know what to do about that, but you guys can understand the answer. The zero knowledge approach here exposes almost no information. I have to say almost. There's timestamps, there's the number of transactions, the timing of transactions. There's a little bit of other metadata, which is not really, which is a very small amount, okay? And all the other approaches, what you just named, Monero, Grin, Dash, they expose a great deal more information.
You'd say it's based on mixing, not zero knowledge.
Yeah, it's basically like instead of, yeah, he says it's based on mixing, not zero knowledge. Instead of saying the sender is, like, you know nothing more about the sender after seeing this ledger than you knew about the identity of the sender before, basically, with this. That's why we call it zero knowledge. With all of those other ones, it's like the sender is one of these 10 or one of these 100 or one of these 1,000 out of all possible senders. And that's a huge difference, which I think historically that kind of thing often proves to be, you know, penetrable by more sophisticated techniques, especially if you include active attacks, which changes everything. So is that good enough? Like, those other ones are just not good enough.
Great, thanks. Yeah, let's start with you.
Hi. Sorry. Thanks for the talk. So I was intrigued by your comparison with HTTPS and anonymous cache. So when I try to think about this, I think about Phil Rogaway's quote that cryptography redistributes power.
Cryptographers do what?
No, cryptography redistributes power.
Ah.
Right? So, and in terms of communication, cryptography, when you protect communication, you're distributing power from powerful entities like governments and giving it to people who don't have that power. But with cash, you're giving more power to the people who have money. And the people who don't have money don't have more power.
Yeah, I like that objection.
So
yeah, thank you for bringing that up.
What's your view on that? Yeah.
People have different intuitions about that, whether making money safer to use in a decentralized way increases power for the powerful or power for the powerless. And my intuition is to the opposite side, that there's more benefit to more people from having economic inclusion and opportunity. Basically, let me put it like this. Powerful rich people already have all the anonymous money transmission they want, right? They don't need to go ask for permission from Visa whenever they want to fill up on gas. And they don't need to, this kind of technology is, it's mass market technology that everyone can use. Does that make sense? That's my intuition about that trade-off.
At the same time, there is cash, right, which is pretty anonymous as well. So for everyday use, you still have cash, which kind of protects your everyday needs.
In the United States, you still have cash. Yeah, not everywhere.
Okay, thanks.
Hi. So thanks for the talk, first of all. You did mention at the beginning that one of the reasons that you have transparent addresses versus, I guess, encrypted addresses, it was in order to help with adoption, right? Especially in the side of exchanges and so on. But today, I guess, the use of transparent addresses in Zcash has become one of the main points of criticism for Zcash.
Yeah.
Given that most of the usage in the transactions in Zcash are not actually anonymous, so the anonymity pool kind of decreases, and there is a whole analysis that was done and so on. So I'm wondering, what's your take on that, and do you guys plan at some point of removing transparent addresses?
I'll answer your real question, but there's a little tangent, so this is a technical audience. There's a common misunderstanding that because the transparent addresses are so frequently used that the effective anonymity pool is small. But for an apples-to-apples comparison, the effective anonymity pool, if you make a Zcash transaction, is probably on the order of 1 million sort of possible other things that happened previously in the blockchain that you could be equally linked to any of the 1 million of them. Whereas with those other lesser technologies that we talked about, the anonymity pool tends to be 10 to 1,000, depending on a whole bunch of questions about the attacker's behavior. Okay? So just to be a little tiny little detail that annoys me, because usually I'm talking to people who can't understand the difference. It's true, the size of the privacy set in Zcash is much smaller than it would be if everyone were using Zatters all the time. And yet, at the same time, it's much bigger than those other options currently. But your question was, what shall we do about this? What everyone involved in Zcash really wants to just deprecate and phase out tatters entirely. To my mind, they've mostly served their purpose, which was, to sort of get the camel's nose under the tent and get Zcash into all these systems. There's basically only 2 more exchanges in the world that aren't on this list yet, and maybe I'll just sacrifice them and move on. I'm afraid that might trigger the regulators because they don't understand that, because they're one of those audiences that can't understand these subtleties, that they might think that somehow fundamentally changes the calculus from their perspective. But I think it'll probably happen because everyone in the Zcash community is pretty enthusiastic about it.
Thanks.
Pardon me. An observation first, and then a real question. The observation is that I'm embarrassed to be Australian. But having said that, and everybody giggles, the reason they did that stupid law in Australia is as a trial balloon for the Five Eyes.
Yeah.
It's coming for you. Well, most of you. It's
only that they thought they could get that one through the easiest.
Yeah, sheep. There are many sheep in Australia. And we as technologists know that the only way they can even attempt to enforce this is very selectively, right? Because it's crypto's in every browser without any backdoor keys. We can download Signal without any backdoor keys, blah, blah, blah. So the only way they can actually enforce this is to wait until somebody does something they don't like and then land on them with a cement mixer. So this is a really nasty law, much nastier than a lot of people give it credit for. But what I really want to stress is, this was a place where they could actually try out this law, because it was never going to happen in even New Zealand, let alone in the US in the current environment. But, watch out, just watch out, be diligent. We do have a social responsibility as professional cryptographers to fight against this stuff. Now the question, if you could go to the slide that was mostly Zadda's.
Like this kind?
That one, yeah. Lots of detail on that slide. I like it, thanks. So I have limited understanding. I've never played with Bitcoin or whatever. But I thought the way you tracked transactions through the Bitcoin ledger was to say, okay, well, Satoshi started off with this Bitcoin and then he split it and then he gave it to somebody. How do you get that when it's all Zadda's? How does a third party verify that you still have the cash that you just gave away? I don't know.
that's the fundamental idea of the zero cash invention, which everyone should go watch Ian Myers' talk from last year at RWC, which is that there in Zcash, there's a zero knowledge proof which says nobody could have come up with this ciphertext unless they knew a spending key that spent some money and hasn't previously spent the same money to anyone else, and the amount of money matches the requirement, the limits on how much money they can spend.
Okay, so it's the
So it's a zero knowledge proof of exactly the integrity constraints you need to prevent the money from being wrong.
Okay, so I guess a follow-up question, that seems to me that it would be only a performance improvement, because you can actually you can look at the one transaction and say, okay, I'm sure that transaction is valid without having to go back through the entire blockchain. Is that true or not?
But no, there's a...
Damn.
Yeah. No, because you've got to prove that the money that you're spending hasn't previously been spent, so you have to refer to a global state of all the money that's ever been spent. And you have to update that continuously, is one of the problems.
Okay, thanks very much.
That's a question that has a long answer.
Yeah,
we'll take one more question.
Yeah, it's probably a very naive question, I guess. I mean, I myself don't use Bitcoins, nothing I know about really. Mostly my concerns were with cryptography and S boxes. But coming to this one, so it looks like the Zcash does not seem to be the only one form of these coins. There may be others, and if there are those others, what are your thoughts about interoperability issues with those? Because senders and recipients may be having different kinds of coins, and they might be registered with the same exchange. So if the sender wants to use more than one type of coin at the same time.
There are lots of different kinds of coins. You shouldn't use IOTA, but all the other ones, well, many of the other ones are good. Even the ones that I was saying aren't good enough are actually pretty good. And the current way that you interoperate between different coins is by going to one of those centralized exchanges and asking them to trade or do some kind of contract for you and hope that they're still there a few minutes later when the contract is done. There's a lot of fun research in the space because the cybercoin space is absolutely the most fun explosion of research in all directions, much of which is really kind of weird. I think trinary is pretty cool. There's some really interesting arithmetic. It's in theory could be more efficient because it's closer to the natural E, but there's a lot of more interesting stuff than that, and it includes decentralized interoperation between different coins, but it's not yet really gotten into full-scale production, but it might soon.
Thank you, sir. Great talk. Thanks.
Thanks.
All right. So with that, I think we're out of time, actually. So thank you very much, Luco.
Okay, thank you.
This is fantastic. All right. So this actually brings us to the end of the conference. So first, I want to have another round of applause for all the speakers for all the 3 days. This is like my favorite conference, so I hope everybody enjoyed it. So I learned a lot. I hope you guys learned a lot from all these talks. Obviously, we're going to be running this every year, so we hope to see all of you next year. So to help us improve, actually, we're going to be sending out a survey to all the attendees. So please fill out the survey. Tell us your opinions. Tell us what you liked, what you didn't like. The survey actually has a text field at the bottom where you can kind of enter comments that are not actually questions on the survey. So feel free to use those. We really look at all the feedback you send, and it really helps us actually design the conference for the coming years. So again, thank you very much, and we are looking forward to seeing everybody next year in Columbia, New York. You want to say a few more words?
There's one person who actually deserves more thanks than anyone, and that's this guy, Dan Bonnet. Let's thank Dan. Thank you. Okay. And I'm contractually obliged to say, that's all, folks. See you next time.